Hello, and welcome to Nature Connects, TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Tricia K, Offshore Wind Policy Manager for the Nature Conservancy. I coordinate TNC's offshore wind work to ensure that it can be used to meet our climate, conservation, and community goals. In order to protect birds and their essential habitats, we need to understand the greatest threats to their survival. These threats include climate change and other human activities such as energy production. All energy projects, from oil and gas extraction to nuclear and wind, create risks for birds. In 2019, the National Audubon Society released a report called Survival by Degrees, which estimated that 2/3 of bird species in the United States and Canada are vulnerable to extinction if we do not address climate change. And as many of you already know, TNC was founded by scientists, citizens, and dedicated leaders who came together with a shared vision to protect and care for nature. Our work on offshore wind includes our perspective as landowners with decades of experience studying and managing lands and waters for the benefit of wildlife, including birds, and the habitats they depend on. Today, we're going to get a better idea of the big picture for birds, what information we have, how we get that information, and what we still need to learn. We're going to talk more about the threats facing bird populations and why scientists who study birds are working on offshore wind. Our webinar today supports the idea that for generations, birds have been our allies in understanding environmental health, if we take the time to listen. We are very fortunate to be able to learn from 4 incredible experts who have made it their lives' work to listen to and learn from birds. Our first presenters are from the National Audubon Society, Dr. Erik Johnson and Dr. Don Lyons. Erik is the Director of Conservation Science at Audubon Delta, a regional office of the National Audubon Society in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. He has worked as a biologist for the Mississippi Flyway and the Gulf Coast Initiative, where he helped develop a community science program in response to the catastrophic Deepwater Horizon oil spill. He has also developed a comprehensive beach nesting bird stewardship program in Louisiana, studies songbird migration, and advocates on large-scale restoration projects, including pushing back on poorly sited energy projects. Don is the Director of Conservation Science at the National Audubon Seabird Institute in Maine. He has spent decades studying seabird colonies, including how to restore these colonies and to understand the relationship between seabirds and forage fish. Presently, he is supervising research about the distribution of key bird species in the Gulf of Maine. Together, Erik and Don will set the stage for us about how birds are indicators of climate change and explain how the information they gather about things like breeding seasons and flight altitude can inform the process of offshore wind sighting and the mitigation we use to reduce risks. Then we'll hear from 2 of TNC's scientists, Alexandra Wilke and Dr. Juliet Lamb. Alex leads TNC's Virginia Coast Reserve Migratory Bird Program. Her primary focus has been on managing TNC's barrier island properties, but more recently she has been studying the migration patterns of shorebirds in relation to offshore wind. She is going to share how TNC studies birds in a place we protect to help fill in data gaps and inform better sighting and mitigation decisions. Juliet is a marine scientist with TNC's Ocean Fisheries Program in New York. She is gathering baseline data for seabirds in the New York Bight, where there are wind projects already under construction. Her work will help us understand some of the drivers for distributions of seabirds and their interactions with offshore wind, and how some of the best ways to reduce impacts to seabirds may be outside of the offshore wind project sites. As you think of questions for our speakers, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will hear from all of our speakers first before the Q&A portion of today's program. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Erik and Don, I'll pass it on to you to get started.
Yeah, how are you all doing? Thanks so much for having me. Again, my name is Erik Johnson. I'm Director of Conservation Science with Audubon in the Delta region. And many of us are here today because we love birds, right? They bring us solace, they bring us peace, they bring us joy. And when we hear about new emerging threats to birds, it raises concerns, justifiably so. And and so I'm going to set the stage today talking about the inherent risks to birds and what we can do about wind energy projects to make them safer and um, more safe for birds. Okay, sorry. So we know that we're losing birds. We've been losing birds for decades, and a really important paper came out about 5 years ago that indicated that 3 billion birds, or just about 3 billion birds, have disappeared from the United States and Canada since 1970. This is especially pronounced in migratory species. So the birds that are moving north and south with the seasons, traveling from Canada and the United States to the Gulf region, to South and Central America, and beyond. And so we are losing these birds primarily because of habitat loss, habitat conversion, coupled with invasive species. And these are really the primary drivers still of bird declines. But there's lots of other things that put birds at risks. One of the most notable is with window collisions in buildings. So all of our homes and our commercial buildings and industry all around the continent result in bird losses. And you can see on this list that wind turbines are certainly not immune to having impacts to birds, but the relative impact across the United States is still relatively small. So collectively, our homes and commercial buildings are killing about 1,000 times more birds than onshore wind turbines. Most of the wind energy development in the United States is still onshore, although it is rapidly moving to offshore, and that is what this webinar is going to address. But it's important to understand the context of this and why we're moving towards wind energy as diversifying our energy infrastructure in the United States. Over the last 800,000 years, the Earth has gone through natural fluctuations in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and as a result, the temperature of the planet. But over these last 800,000 years, we have not exceeded 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As of this year, we have already broken 400 parts per million, 50% more than the max carbon dioxide observed over the last 800,000 years. And if we do nothing to control these emissions, we could potentially double our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by the end of this century. Carbon dioxide acts as what we know as a greenhouse gas. It takes radiation from the sun, scatters it, and disperses it as heat. So there's a direct correlation with more carbon in the atmosphere and warmer temperatures. We do have the ability to adjust how much carbon we emit into the atmosphere. There are obviously political and economic and all kinds of constraints in doing so. And as we think about transitioning our energy infrastructure from fossil fuels to more renewable infrastructure such as wind, the rate at which we do this will impact how much warmer this planet will get. And so under these 5 different scenarios, we will experience different levels of warming across the planet, depending on how rapidly we act. Where I live in coastal Louisiana, we have already lost 2,000 square miles of coastal wetlands to erosion, to hurricanes, and to the channeling of the Mississippi River, resulting in a sediment-starved landscape. This is equivalent to about the size of Delaware that we have lost. And if we don't address the underlying issue of climate change, we will continue to see sea level rise that will swamp another 3,000 square miles of land, another state of Delaware, over the next 50 years. And so it's not only the temperature, it's sea level rise, it's rainfall patterns. These are all threats to us, our human communities, as well as to birds. And birds are really important indicators of the environment. They're sensitive to environmental changes. They're signals of a changing climate. We're already seeing northward shifts of bird populations from data sets like the Audubon Christmas bird count over the last 50 years. And as was mentioned, about 2/3 of all bird species in the United States and Canada are at threat of a severe range contraction and possible extinction by 2100 if we don't address the underlying risk of climate change. So here are a couple of examples of those species that are potentially going to be impacted by a changing climate. The Audubon Society scientists, their national science team, produced models of over 600 species that related the temperature and the precipitation variables associated with their current range distribution and projected forward by 2100 what might happen to their ranges under different scenarios of climate change. So here's a 1.5 degree Celsius change, which is one of the more optimistic changes we could potentially experience, as well as a 3 degrees Celsius change. The blue are the areas where the climate becomes more suitable for these birds, and the red are areas where the climate would potentially become less suitable for these birds. However, even if the climate is more suitable, the habitat may not necessarily be there. So while they may be losing ground, even though the climate may be suitable for them to gain ground, the habitat may not be there. Here's another example with the indigo bunting, one of our beloved songbirds of the eastern United States. And under a 3 degree climate change scenario, we can expect significant range contractions of this beloved bird. So as we think about the offshore wind energy environment, these wind farms are going to get larger, and they're going to be larger than the onshore environment of wind energy production. Some of these wind farms offshore by 2035 could be as tall as about 1,000 feet, or about 300 meters. And so that sets a framework for us to understand the risk to the potential risk to birds as scientists are figuring out the interaction between birds and wind energy infrastructure, both onshore and offshore. And one way that we think about this is in terms of the windswept area. So there's a safe zone below the blade length and above the blade length. And again, for offshore wind energy development, we're talking about 1,000 feet in height. And so not only is colliding with these wind energy infrastructure facilities a risk, but also birds could potentially avoid them, which is, a positive for that individual bird, but it's also a way of losing habitat. So if you think about a loon foraging on fish, they may avoid these wind areas and thus lose the available habitat offshore. And so as we think about how to address these issues for birds, we often refer back to this mitigation hierarchy where well-sited projects are really important, and where they are sited, we need to minimize the risk through various technologies, and where the risk can't be minimized, there needs to be some kind of compensation or offset to help birds elsewhere to offset potential losses. And so you're going to see some of the technologies that scientists are using. One of the ones that we're starting to deploy across the Mississippi Flyway to understand the 2 billion birds that are crossing the Gulf of Mexico each spring are these multi-sensor geolocators that we've begun to attach to birds like prothonotary warblers and Swainson's warblers. And the really neat things about this is that we can measure flight altitude every 30 minutes as these birds are crossing the Gulf of Mexico, which will give us an assessment of their risk as wind energy projects are being considered offshore. Here's an example from the Swainson's warbler done by Garrett Ryan, a graduate student at Louisiana State University. You can see when they depart the Yucatan Peninsula, and the altitude here is in meters, right? So remember, this windswept area is about 300 meters. These birds are taking 18 hours to cross the Gulf of Mexico. And all 6 of the birds that he deployed were well above the windswept zone as they entered the Northern Gulf airspace. So it's encouraging, but there's a lot more of this work being done. And now I'm happy to pass it off to Dr. Don Lyons to talk about his research in the Gulf of Maine.
Thanks so much, Eric. That's a great big picture overview. Uh, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a very specific area as a case study on the interaction of birds and offshore wind and how we can design these projects or site these projects to avoid as much interaction or potential impact as possible. Most of my work happens in the Gulf of Maine, up in the northeast corner of the United States. The Gulf of Maine actually spans the US-Canadian border. So it includes the shoreline and coastal areas of 3 states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, and 2 provinces, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And it's one of the areas that the federal government is considering for offshore wind. There are a number of these around the country. The Gulf of Maine up there in the upper right is one in particular. There are no turbines in the water there yet, but the planning process is proceeding, and for good reason. This figure maps out kind of the wind speed or sustained wind speed in areas of our exclusive economic zone or our coastal areas that the federal government manages. And you can see the really deep reds in the Gulf of Maine. There are a high quality wind there, very much high speed sustained wind, so an excellent potential source of power. So it makes sense for us to look at these areas as we consider our opportunities for renewable energies and opportunities to reduce our carbon footprint and kind of resist the worst impacts of climate change. Uh, the Gulf of Maine, though, it is an area that is full of birds and very much feeling the impact of climate change currently. This figure shows that in a graphical sense. The horizontal scale there is year, and each month is stacked starting with January down to December. And all you need to take away from this figure is there's a lot more red in recent years. Temperatures have been much warmer. We've experienced a series of marine heat waves where the ocean has been much warmer than typical for sustained periods. And so we're definitely feeling the impacts of climate change, and thus are very motivated to look at renewable energy as a part of the solution or a part of our reaction to this. The birds in the Gulf of Maine are also responding to these conditions, generally not favorably. Atlantic puffins are one of our most iconic species in the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf represents the southern end of their breeding distribution on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see in this figure the productivity at a couple of the puffin nesting islands is plotted out. That productivity averages or it ends up between 0 and 1 because puffins only lay 1 egg per year, thus just have the opportunity to raise 1 chick to fledge. And in these years, which are shown in these red boxes, red bars, we've experienced marine heat waves, and you can see that the productivity of puffins really plummets in those years. So even though the birds of the Gulf of Maine will be exposed to offshore wind and face potential impacts, they very much need that benefit of renewable energy. So we're very motivated to go through this process as certainly as thoughtfully as we can. But just to point out, even in areas where birds are out in the ocean and potentially interacting with offshore wind, they still very much need this transition to clean renewable energy. As Erik alluded to, our approach to offshore wind to kind of minimize any detrimental impacts on birds and other wildlife fits into what we sometimes call the mitigation hierarchy. Kind of the first step to that is to avoid overlap of offshore wind projects and the areas most important to wildlife, particularly wildlife species that may be threatened or endangered. There will inevitably be overlap. There are birds and other wildlife in all areas of the ocean. So there will inevitably be some overlap. In those areas, we want to minimize the impact of that of wind projects, and that could be potentially through operational opportunities, such as maybe shutting down turbines during the peak of migration, or minimizing the degree that lighting might be an attractant to birds that's on these turbines. In situations where it's difficult to minimize an impact, our strategy would be to mitigate for that impact, compensate somehow through conservation actions, either in the project area or perhaps outside of the project area. For seabirds, that might be restoring colonies or protecting birds while nesting at colonies so that they produce more fledglings. And then finally, there will be a lot of unknowns as we embark on this process. Our information will never be complete. So we need to monitor very closely how birds respond to these installations as they go in, so that we can respond to any unexpected outcomes. In the Gulf of Maine, we worked very hard on that first step prior to any turbines being installed in the water. That's that avoidance step. The federal government manages this process through an agency called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, I'll refer to it as. And they use a multi-step process, first defining an area of possible interest, and then collecting information in a series of steps to try and rule out places where there would be very, very clear and documented impacts or conflict with other uses of the ocean or other wildlife. And this figure shows a couple of the initial stages for the Gulf of Maine. That black line here shows the initial area of potential interest. And then the green shaded area is what was called the draft call area, kind of the very first area that was considered. The multi-step process that BOEM follows essentially eliminates space from their initial area for a variety of reasons, any sort of reasons that the public or other government agencies bring forth as potential serious conflicts. When we became aware of the interest in offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, we began quickly moving, and this is National Audubon's Seabird Institute, along with a whole multitude of partners working in the region, to characterize how birds use the Gulf of Maine. And in particular, Audubon focused on colonies of seabirds where we have worked for over 50 years to restore and protect colonies of seabirds of Atlantic puffins, shown here, and a variety of other species. And to understand where birds are using, or what portions of the ocean birds are using while they're nesting, we've put GPS tracking tags on them. On puffins, we generally attach these either to feathers on their back, or we use sutures to attach them to the skin on their back. And this is just an example of puffin movements of birds nesting at one of our islands in 1 year. This happens to be Matinicus Rock off Penobscot Bay in coastal Maine. The purple dots represent GPS locations, very high precision locations. And this polygon, this kind of beige polygon shown here, is that draft call area. So that draft call area was defined around the beginning of 2023. The data we had available at that time was through the summer of 2022. And we see clearly that puffins were using a portion of that draft call area, so a lot of overlap, which certainly raised concerns for us and other folks who worked very hard on puffin conservation in Maine. Here's a similar figure for a couple other species. This is both common and Arctic tern foraging movements, and these are nesting birds. These are birds nesting across 3 islands in coastal Maine. There's 2 colors there. The gold is common terns. The teal dots there are Arctic terns. And again, you can see a fair amount of overlap in their foraging movements and this draft call area. So this information was collected for multiple species and shared with BOEM, a lot of other environmental NGOs, a lot of other state and federal agencies. And definitely there was a fair amount of advocacy work to push that call area away from these nesting islands. We felt it was particularly important to avoid overlap of a wind project with areas used by many nesting birds, because these nesting birds could potentially enter these areas multiple times per day. Just the degree of exposure would be quite significant. And I'm glad to say that BOEM took these and certainly other considerations, other information into consideration. And this is kind of a complex overview of the process and the eventual outcome. The shades of purple here, from the lightest shade, which is almost pink, to the darkest shade kind of in the middle of the Gulf of Maine, represent the various steps in BOEM's process as they refined this potential area of wind power development. And then the crosshatch areas you see here are the lease areas that BOEM intends to put up for auction, actually just later this month, to various companies in the offshore wind industry for their development. You can see there's 3 colored polygons here representing the distributions, foraging distributions of the 3 species I've already outlined. These figures include later years data and data from multiple islands where we've been able to tag these birds. And we're very pleased that there's minimal overlap between the distribution of these 3 species while they're foraging to raise their chicks and those crosshatched lease areas. So this is just an example of kind of the interaction or interplay between the development process, kind of the planning process that the federal government follows, and the process that the community of researchers, agency biologists, NGO biologists, and advocates, and how that can come to a solution that can minimize the exposure of very high priority species. Another species that nests in the Gulf of Maine, which happens to be on the endangered species list, the federal endangered species list, is the roseate tern. Because they are endangered, tagging of this species is quite limited compared to some of the others which are not quite as threatened. But we're also pleased that these lease areas shown here in these beige polygons do not overlap much with some of the first data we've collected on roseate terns. And those data there represent both the activity of these terns while nesting at Stratton Island in Maine, and their movements following nesting. These birds typically go down to Cape Cod and stage for several weeks before migrating to South America. And so our data so far show that placement of these lease areas does not extensively overlap with the activity of roseate terns, which is quite a good outcome. We do have some concerns about colonies where we haven't yet tagged or movements when birds are not nesting. This is some example tracks of common terns. Common terns also stage at Cape Cod after breeding. Common terns nesting in the Gulf of Maine. They travel to the Cape often in fairly direct routes from the nesting colonies where they've nested. The colonies shown in colors here are colonies where common terns have been tracked, and we've collected some of these data. The colonies in black here are colonies in Canada. The first birds were tagged there this summer, and we're hopeful to have data to complete this type of figure very soon. But we are concerned about these non-breeding season movements. Now, they move through these areas much less frequently than while nesting, so the level of exposure is far less, but still something that we need to consider. These birds also represent a number of songbirds, bats, and other species that migrate across the Gulf of Maine, maybe only twice a year, but certainly a consideration we need to have in mind as we both cite projects and then develop them, decide how they should be operated and managed. But not every species can be avoided, or the possible exposure of every species cannot be avoided. We have nesting Leach's storm petrels in Maine as well. It's a species that's not as well known because they're rarely seen during the day anywhere near the coast. They are somewhat related to albatross, or relatively closely related to albatross, but actually only about the size of an American robin. So quite a small bird, but one that ranges widely. Their foraging trips while nesting last multiple days, and they can go hundreds of miles on those trips. This figure shows some example tracks from birds nesting at Matinicus Rock again, and they go all the way past Georges Bank out to the continental shelf break, several hundred miles away from their nesting colony. Quite impressive movements, and they also spread out and use much of the Gulf of Maine. In the context of offshore wind, it's not really possible for us to put wind projects in a place that Leach's storm petrels are not likely to use. So this is a species where it's not possible to avoid exposure. So we need very much to minimize the impacts of that exposure. And that exposure, while Leach's storm petrels are nesting, may be up to 40 times a summer on each of their trips. We don't know a lot about their risk at this point. We believe their risk will be low for collision because they generally fly very close to the surface of the water. But they do have a known susceptibility to being attracted to lighted structures in the ocean. So certainly the techniques used to light these structures, which is necessary for human safety, for the flight of aircraft or the travel of boats through these waters. But that needs to be managed very carefully to avoid an attraction. And very little's known about their behavior, their possible avoidance of these structures during the daytime. So a lot of unknowns here. This is one where a lot of monitoring work will need to continue and possible mitigation. But I want to leave you quickly just with the full perspective of offshore wind. What I've covered is primarily activity to help inform this process prior to siting of projects. But there's a lot of work after a location is specified to further understand environmental impacts, and then how to minimize those impacts and then potentially mitigate. So in this figure from BOEM, we're still very much in the Gulf of Maine and in most of the United States, just on the left side of all of this processing in the dark blue. So a lot of work goes into the siting, but a lot of work remains after that. And with that, I'll wrap up and look forward to the next presentations.
Thank you so much, Don, and Erik, for those great presentations. And I'm going to turn it over now to Alex and Juliet, who are going to share some of the work they're doing for TNC.
Okay, thanks, Trish. And thanks so much, Don and Erik, for those presentations. Juliet and I are going to, we're going to move into talking about a couple examples of how TNC is working to generate shorebird and seabird movement data specifically to inform the offshore wind industry. And we also want to give you a little bit more of a glimpse of what it looks like to be conducting these types of projects in the field. So you've heard a little bit about this today, but with these projects, we're thinking about these really important questions of, how are birds using the marine environment throughout the year and during different phases of their life cycle? So questions like, when are they moving out over the open ocean? Where exactly are they going? What are they doing and what's driving those behaviors? And then, of course, that really important question of how high are they flying when they're engaged in these activities? Because that's so important in the context of offshore wind. So we hope that with these examples, you'll not only get that better understanding of what it takes to conduct these types of projects, but you'll also come away with a better understanding of just one more way that the Nature Conservancy is engaged in ensuring that offshore wind is a success for nature and people. So the first example that I'll talk about is work that's taking place where I'm based here at the Nature Conservancy's Volgenaut Virginia Coast Reserve. We're located down here on the southern end of the Delmarva Peninsula. And this work is being done in cooperation with the Center for Conservation Biology at William & Mary. And funding for this work in part is coming from Dominion Energy and the Volgenaut Foundation. And so for the past several years, we had been focused on collecting tracking data for two shorebird species in particular, the eastern willet shown here on the left and the whimbrel shown on the right. And these two species give us really unique opportunities to evaluate these birds' migrations over the open ocean because we can strategically put tags on them right before they undertake transoceanic flights to their non-breeding grounds in South America. And in the case of the willet, that's right after they've wrapped up their breeding season because we have them breeding here in Virginia. And in the case of the whimbrel, it's right after they have stopped and staged and rested here in Virginia during their southbound migration from breeding grounds and again on their way to South America to their non-breeding grounds. And these projects are also taking place very close by to where Dominion Energy is currently in the process of constructing the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, or CVOW project. And you can see that lease area here with the yellow squares on the top here. And so that really sets the stage nicely for us to think about these bird movements in relation to a specific project that's under construction. So how do we track these birds? And Erik mentioned this, another type of transmitter, but the technology that we have available now to track birds of this size with really high resolution it's amazing, and it's getting better every day. But we're able to use these really small advanced GPS transmitters, and you can see them on the birds here on the right, that weigh just a few grams. So 9 grams for the tags we're using on whimbrel and 3 grams on the willet. And these devices have their own little solar panels, so they can charge their own batteries, and they can communicate the data that they're collecting through either cellular networks or Bluetooth receivers. So once these tags are out on the birds, they're collecting data points at intervals that we can customize. And then each data point has a variety of variables associated with it. So where the location of the bird, its speed, its direction, the battery life of the tag, and some others. And these devices can even tell us about the bird's altitude in flight, which is that really important variable that we've mentioned. Another really amazing function of these tags is that we can customize the data collection at an even finer scale with what are called geofences. So what that means is we can actually program a tag to collect more or less points over time, depending on whether a bird is within or outside a geofence. And basically what a geofence is, a specific predefined space on the earth. So if you look at the figure on the right here, These red and green boxes are the actual geofences that we have set up for our Wimbrel project. So we have it set so that the tags are collecting a lot of data points when they're within any one of those boxes. So we get that really high resolution data to look at these questions in the context of offshore wind. And then when the birds move away from that, the tags scale back their data collection and save battery life and memory space. So we use a variety of techniques to capture these birds. We use things that are called capture carpets to catch Wimbrel on mudflats when they're foraging. For the willets, again, that are nesting here, we can simply use long-handled soft mesh nets to catch them on their nests. And then once we have the birds in hand, we put their bands on, they get all sorts of measurements taken, they get their tags, and they also get these uniquely coded light green flags on them. And then once we know and can see that the birds are doing well, that they're holding the tags well, we release them where we captured them. And this is just a quick video of one of our Wimbrel being released in the marshes off the seaside of Virginia. So these projects are ongoing and we still have data streams coming in as we speak. But I wanted to show you just a couple examples of the type of movement data that we're collecting with the tags. So this figure shows you a composite map of Wimbrel movements from the birds that we tagged in 2022 and 2023. And this data goes up through spring of 2024. So this just right off the bat, and you've seen maps in Don's presentation, but it gives you an idea of the incredible stories that these tags tell in terms of how these birds are moving at these really large scales across the entire Western Hemisphere. And then we can really zoom in on these movements to start asking specific questions like we have for this project. How are these birds potentially interacting with the sea vowel lease area? So if you look at the orange flight paths on this map, these are the southbound migrations of Wimbrel leaving the eastern shore of Virginia. And you can see we've had 4 birds that have passed during this time frame through the sea vowel lease area, which is shown in the light gray here. And I wanted to point out we've also had an additional 9 birds pass through Dominion's newly acquired lease area, which lies just to the east of sea vowel. So these are just some examples, and the next steps for this project is a deeper analysis of that data to fill that important missing piece of information of how high were those Wimbrel flying while they were over the outer continental shelf, and that will allow us to continue to evaluate, what their risk might be in terms of interacting with those wind turbines. So we're going to move up to the north, and Juliet is going to take over from here and talk about some of her projects.
All right, thank you, Alex. And I'm going to wrap up with a few more examples of what we're doing up here in the New York Bight. So the New York Bight extends from Long Island through southern New Jersey, and we have 6 active wind lease areas in the region, as well as more on the way. And we are right next door to southern New England, where there are several active and under construction wind farms. So in this region, we're really focusing on data gaps around at-sea habitat use of seabirds, and especially of seabirds that don't breed in the area, which is most of the seabirds, actually seabird species that are in the New York Bight. And outside their breeding season, seabirds are pretty difficult to study because they spend most of their time out at sea, and it's often unclear what habitat features they're relying on and where, when, and how they might be interacting with offshore wind energy. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a taste of just 2 of our seabird projects up here in the New York Bight. The first of these is focused on northern gannets, which you probably all know. They're often flying close to coastlines and making spectacular plunge dives, and they're a lot of fun to watch. One of the seabirds that you can actually see from land often. Gannets occur all along the Atlantic coast and into the Gulf of Mexico, but their only breeding colonies in North America are in Atlantic Canada. So that means in the New York Bight, they're only around from about October through April of each year. And they've shown high levels of displacement after construction of offshore wind farms in Europe. So we really want to know how they use offshore habitats in this area before construction starts, so that we can document changes in habitat use after wind farms are built, and also so we can identify important habitats and resources that could be targets for mitigation. Next slide. So there's a previous tracking study from 2017 that showed that this area was a hotspot for wintering gannets, but the technology wasn't great at the time, so the precision of these data was pretty low. So we're trying to really find out in more detail what gannets are doing and what habitats they're using while they're here. And you can see an example of a foraging flock of gannets right offshore of southern Long Island, close to New York City. Next slide. So how are we doing this? We captured gannets at sea using long-handled nets from a boat. So we drive our boat into a group of foraging gannets like the one shown here, and capture birds as they're coming up from dives. And then we attach solar-powered GPS transmitters to their tails using tape. These transmitters store a point every 15 to 30 minutes, and they send them to a web portal whenever they're in range of the cell tower network. And then they fall off after several months when the birds molt their tail feathers. Next slide. So our results so far show that gannets mostly stay close to the coastline during their normal foraging movements in the region. But they also move long distances during winter. So often they're commuting back and forth between New York Harbor and down in the mouth of the Delaware Bay. So these movements are taking them across wind-lease areas frequently during their wintering period. And in addition, we found that these migratory gannets are moving through, in some cases, a lot of different wind-lease areas on their way north to their breeding colonies. In other cases, very few. So there's a wide variety between individuals and what kind of pathways they're using and how much they're being exposed to offshore wind energy developments. So these are very preliminary results at the moment, but we're planning future work to explore individual and environmental causes of variation in movement and variation in risk exposure to help predict which gannets are likely to be exposed to offshore wind infrastructure and under what conditions. Next slide. So my second example is from some brand new research that we just conducted this year, started this year on great shearwaters, which are closely related to albatrosses. So great shearwaters breed in the southern hemisphere on remote islands midway between South America and Africa, and they spend their non-breeding period, which is our summer months, spread throughout the Atlantic Ocean, including in the New York Bight. So this species had previously been tracked further north, up in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy, but none of those birds in those studies actually ventured into the New York Bight. So we know that shearwaters are here, but we don't really know what they're doing, whether they're part of the same wintering population, and how they might react to offshore wind. And in areas of Europe where there are existing wind farms, there aren't a lot of data from tube noses and similar species to shearwaters. But the limited data that exists suggests that there may be really significant displacement effects for these birds. Next slide. So our capture methods here were pretty similar as with northern gannets. We were able to capture shearwaters during the summer, which is a lot nicer time to be out on a boat. We deployed the transmitters using leg loop harnesses, so little harnesses that go over both legs, and these are designed to stay on the birds for longer than the tape attachments that we use for the gannets. We don't have any data that we can share yet from this work, but we've seen that shearwaters make extensive movements up and down the Atlantic coast during the summer, while usually remaining further offshore and often over the continental shelf. So we're continuing this work into the future to find out more about these birds and how they're interacting with offshore wind in our region. Next slide. So just to wrap up, these projects are all going to ultimately contribute to offshore wind energy planning in various important ways. So as Dawn mentioned, the site selection process is being informed by tracking data, which we're submitting to BOEM and to other regulatory agencies to help identify important habitats that aren't captured by at-sea survey data. So these include these kind of commuting and movement corridors. We are also contributing our data to public databases to help inform other people that are doing work to synthesize data across the region. Movement data help us to understand how birds will experience cumulative effects across multiple different wind energy installations. And we're working with groups like the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative to develop science plans and priority research directions. And finally, our data can help identify the characteristics of important at-sea habitats, which we can use to inform development of mitigation plans to offset any expected impacts to seabirds by actions that improve habitat quality for seabirds and their prey. All right. I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet and Alex. Thank you, all of you, for these fantastic presentations. Wow, it's so fascinating. God, I love maps. And just thank you for sharing your incredible expertise with us today. I'm going to go directly to, because we've had 4 presenters today, I'm going to go directly to some of the questions that we have in our Q&A so that we have some time to answer that. And we're trying to answer some of the questions in writing during the webinar. So look for answers in the Q&A if we don't answer your question live. This is more of a statement than a question, but it is an interesting comment. And we've heard from all the presenters you talking about a number of different bird species that you're tracking, but Obviously, that's not all the bird species that are using the coast or maybe interacting with wind farms. Why are you focused on the species you're focused on? And how do we deal with the fact that there might be species we're not tracking that are vulnerable to offshore wind infrastructure? Go ahead, Alex.
Thanks, Trish. That's a great question. I was just going to answer, in the context of the projects that I talked about. We've focused for this work on two specific shorebird species because we acknowledge the fact that they are undertaking these transoceanic flights to their non-breeding grounds. And we also know that they're likely representative of a much larger group of shorebirds that is, undertaking the same types of flights. So we're hoping that it's a good first step to use those as indicator species to sort of set the, pave the way for figuring out how all of these birds are using that marine environment.
Go ahead, Juliet.
I would say also there have been a few different vulnerability analyses that have actually looked at a lot of different factors, like the population numbers of a species, their flight behavior, and sort of other characteristics, and how they use their presence in these offshore areas. And kind of combining those things together, you can get a sense of like what are the priority species that we really need to be focusing on because of all those three factors.
Very helpful. So another question we have is, we've talked about this on several webinars in different contexts, is that Europe is really moving at kind of a light speed when it comes to deployment of offshore wind. Is there anything that we can learn or are learning about interactions with birds in offshore wind structure, let's say in the North Sea, or from their work?
Yes, I can talk about this one too. So we recently published a meta-analysis where we went through and looked at all of the reports and papers that had come out of various studies of European wind farms. And from there, we could sort of kind of synthesize all of that information and figure out what were the kind of monitoring protocols that were best able to detect changes and what species of birds were most vulnerable to changes. So if you give me a minute, I can find the link and paste that in the chat. But yes, we have a lot to learn from the European context and a lot of really great information that's already out there.
Go ahead, Erik.
Yeah, I mean, that's phenomenal analysis that Dr. Lamb has done. And so it has limitations though, right? So there are species like pelicans and terns that don't exist up there. So as we're thinking about offshore wind development, particularly in, all three coasts, right? The Gulf, Pacific, and Atlantic, we have a suite of species that we're kind of starting from scratch on. And so there's been great work on things like what they call divers that we call loons, right? That are probably really applicable. But there's other species where we have to kind of begin. But the math and in terms of figuring out exactly how to do that groundwork has been laid in a way, and so we can just build on it, which is really phenomenal. So I think getting up to speed is going to happen a lot faster in the United States because we're able to use those examples that they've been doing for a decade plus already in Europe.
That's great. That's helpful. So we've had this question in the past too, and today. Can you talk a little bit about whether the bird tagging hurts birds, and then just what the process is for how you get the information from the tags, which is kind of like a technical question, I guess, but nerdy minds want to know. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, it is an important question. We don't want to impact these birds. We don't want to impact their behavior. We want to really have them represent what all birds are doing. We do that in a few ways. Tags are generally less than 3% of the body weight of the bird. And attachment techniques, kind of how the tags attach to the bird is very specific and has been tuned very carefully for each of the bird species that we track in this way. There's a lot of different ways of getting data back, and There's very sophisticated ways that require a lot of electronics and a lot of battery power on a tag. Like you can transmit data up to a satellite, and then that satellite transfers it to the internet, and you get data every day. With the tracking we've done in the Gulf of Maine, we use tags that transmit through a radio connection to a small radio that we set at colonies and known roost sites. When the bird's in the vicinity of that, the data can be transferred. So we get data when a bird kind of comes around to the place we're expecting it to be. But some tags only store data on the tag itself and don't transmit it in any way. That allows them to be much lighter, and so be placed on much smaller birds. But it means you have to put the tag on the bird and then sometime later get that bird back in your hands and take the tag off and get the data back that way.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Alex, there's a question specific to you just with respect to whimbrels, and curious to hear how well the whimbrel tags are able to measure altitude. Have you had consistent and reliable results there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we are currently, I mentioned sort of getting into that deeper analysis of that data. There does seem to be, and Juliet probably has something to say about this too, but there does seem to be more errors with the altitude data that these newer tags are collecting. But there are ways to sort of work with that and tease out the best information that we can get. So I think the larger sort of there's a collective effort now to think about what those best practices are and how people who are putting these tags out can follow those types of practices to sort of work with that data to make sure that we're all doing the most consistent thing possible so that we can compare results across species and across tags. And yeah, but that's a really good question. It's a pretty new type of information that we're getting from some of these smaller tags.
And I would say that those barometric pressure sensors that Erik shared at the beginning aren't yet waterproof for use on birds that are spending a lot of time out in the water. So that's something that's an active area of like tech development to try to get a better sensor that'll give us more accurate altitude measurements.
That's great. So we're nearing the end of our time today. Before I wrap up, just want to ask if each of you want to share in a single sentence or 15 seconds or less a final parting thought. And we'll start with Dr. Erik Johnson.
Well, I guess, to sort of bring my point home is that we have to figure out how to diversify our energy infrastructure, not only for, environmental, human safety reasons, but also for economic reasons. The world is going forward with these technologies and diversifying their energy infrastructure. And we need to make sure that, the United States helps lead this transition. And that'll create jobs, that'll create benefits for wildlife. But we have to do it responsibly, and we have to do it now. And so we're in a place as researchers where we're trying to figure out how to measure the risks at a rate that is, in step with the advancement of this technology. And so we're in a really critical time period right now to get this done and do it well. Because if we fail, if we have these projects that end up killing a lot of birds, it's going to set back the industry as a whole and really inhibit our ability to transition off of fossil fuels. So the work that this team is doing, this group is doing, is absolutely critical to the future of climate change on the planet.
Thanks. And we're going to end on that because we're at time. And I just want to, and it was a great parting thought, but we want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank our guests. Thank you again to all who support TNC so generously. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the next few days with a recording to this webinar. We appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment to respond to the poll on your screen before you drop off. And if you're enjoying our webinars, please be sure to share them with your friends and colleagues. You can follow us on social media at conserve_NC MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities. And as always, you can register for future webinars at nature.org/MA webinars. Our next webinar in the series will take place on November 14th at noon Eastern Time, and we'll be talking about fish. We'll hear from Dr. Brendan Rundy, a marine scientist with TNC's Virginia chapter, and Annie Murphy, a biogeochemist and principal scientist at Inspire Environmental, about what they're measuring underwater, why, and what they're learning. We hope you can join us then. Thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.